Salutations, APUSH students. This is Chapter 28, Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt, 1901-1912. This is part of a kind of two-part lecture. Chapter 29 is also going to deal with the progressive movement, but just as long as you're keeping in mind that the time period in the late 1800s and early 1900s kind of overlaps with the Gilded Age is known as the progressive movement. And so remember all the stuff from period 6, the urbanization, industrialization that happens in the United States. It radically changes the way Americans live and work, and it's going to lead to a number of problems in society. So the progressive movement is a widespread series of reforms aimed at addressing some of those issues. So we're going to look at the role women played in progressive reforms, who the progressives were and what their goals were, some of the notable reforms, and then how this idea of progressivism goes into the actions of the presidency, particularly in the presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. So let's get started. The progressive ideas were influenced by America's transition to an industrial economy. For most of American history, there has been this idea that America is the land of rugged individualists, and individualism was the ideal goal for everyone. And government should largely stay out of the way and allow people to kind of do things their own way. And up to this point, you really need to remember that the government really didn't intervene a lot in the economy except in making trade and banking a lot easier. So the role of government largely facilitated the growth of industrialization and business up until this point. But then you have these abuses in the business practices, and you have the growth of monopolies, and all that transportation is leading to corporations becoming bigger and bigger. So progressives are now challenging this idea of individualism by saying that the new modern age requires new responsibilities from the government and the people. By taking more control over the government, the people could then intervene and improve the lives of all. So we're starting to see government as a means of improvement and intervention. So a lot of this change and a lot of this action is going to be aimed at what is seen as the emerging class conflict between the rich and poor, and an increasing call to both regulate the actions of the rich and the corporations and to improve the lives of the poor through government action and regulation. So some notable works, Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, was published in 1890 and depicted life in the tenements in great detail. This shocked middle-class audiences and led to a push for reforms in housing. Riis would even take people on tours of tenements so that people could witness firsthand the poor conditions he had written about in his book. He's also one of the first journalists at this time to utilize cameras to take pictures of these tenements and the tenement families, which is going to have an important effect on backing up those claims and adding a human face to those words on a page. One of the people who joined Riis on his tenement tour was Theodore Roosevelt, and we're going to see that this has an impact on Roosevelt and is going to influence some of his later actions to address these issues of inequality and poverty. Also prominent during this time is the social gospel movement, which combined Christian teachings with social action aimed at improving housing and targeting poverty. So just remember, there's no one single issue that progressives targeted, but it's important to know there were a lot of different issues related to more accountability in the government, addressing issues of poverty and inequality, and reining in abusive business practices and using the government as a tool to help protect the people. So here's one of Riis's pictures, as I mentioned, of a tenement family living in a tenement apartment building. Remember those dumbbell tenements from a few chapters ago? This is one of those front parlor rooms where you have a family of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, living in a very, very small apartment. So it's one thing to read about how poor these conditions were, but actually seeing it and seeing the people, that's going to really affect a lot of people, and it's going to motivate people to try to help improve these conditions. In earlier chapters, I talked about the availability of magazines and the increased production of a lot of journalism during this time. So magazines like McClure's, Cosmopolitan, Collier's, and Everybody's they had extensive readership and a lot of money to be able to finance investigative journalism. These journalists would often target corporations and address other social issues in order to publicize and reveal it to the American public. This led to them being referred to by the derogatory term muckraker. So this phrase was apparently coined by Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt, it's complicated because he would use journalists to promote some of his ideas and pressure the public to support some of his policies. So he wasn't really necessarily against journalism, but there was this more sensationalist type of story that was meant to kind of scare the people. And those are the people he was referring to as a muckraker, not really as a reputable journalist. So, a muckraker It's now used to refer to all of the investigative journalists from the progressive era. Back then, it was only meant to target like a couple of the really maybe unscrupulous journalists who maybe overinflated their stories. But nowadays, regardless of what it meant at the time, a muckraker now refers to a journalist from the progressive era who would kind of try to dig deep and try to reveal things that people were trying to keep secret. So some prominent examples are Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens. Ida Tarbell investigated the business practices of the Standard Oil Company, and her subsequent writings in McClure's magazine detailed the corrupt business practices of Standard Oil and was one of the big contributing factors in Standard Oil being broken up as a corporation in 1911. Lincoln Steffens' work, Shame of the City. Oh, I almost sneezed. But you know what? We're going to keep it in there for you people who actually listen to these lectures. So there you go. Shame of the Cities was an investigation of corruption in the urban political system. So those urban political machines, think of like your Boss Tweeds, okay? Lincoln Steffens was detailing that. You know, all these works were meant to provide public response and get the public to get kind of angry about a topic, which would then hopefully lead to some kind of government action, you know, against these problems. So the muckrakers were good at identifying a lot of problems in American society and how it was, you know, how American democracy, how the government was failing to address these social issues. And not a lot of the muckraking articles had a lot of solutions. They were more about publicizing the problems. And the big solution to the failures of democracy, according to the progressives, was more democracy. Get more people involved, have more people informed on the issues, and get more people to pay attention. And so that was seen as a solution to addressing these problems. There's a lot of different types of progressivism, you know, political progressivism, and then there's organizations. Let's talk about, you know, both of those, but let's start with the goals, really. So progressives were essentially a group that were trying to improve the lives of everyday people and curb the powers of oppressive businesses and give more people a say in their government. So because, you know, at this time, businesses were so tied up in the government, and we know that government was very corrupt at the time on a local, state, and federal level, several proposals are going to come forward to try to kind of rein this in. They include things like a direct primary, which meant that a candidate would be elected directly by the people instead of by a political boss who would often handpick their own people to serve in a public office. Initiative and referendum were the ideas that individual people could directly propose legislation, and then the people could vote on that legislation. So you see, even on ballots today, that there's always referenda in every voting cycle. So in 2020, for example, Virginia, we just had a referendum on redrawing the voting districts for the state. So that's an example. So other issues in the recent past have been related to the legalization of marijuana or same-sex marriage, things like that. So those things, you know, are on the ballots because the people of those states have proposed that they become laws and have gathered enough support from individuals to get them on the ballots. Recall is when people can be removed from office, such as judges or even the governor of a state. A lot of judges typically serve for life, but if they're doing something, if they are seen as corrupt or they're ruling in a way that the people don't like, they can be recalled from office. In American history, though, only one governor has actually ever been recalled from office or kicked out before their term was over. Plenty of governors have been impeached, but that's a totally different process. Being impeached means that the legislative branch of that state government is going to remove you from office, but recall is when the people actually vote whether or not to remove you from office. So I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but just remember that, you know, things like initiative, referendum, and recall were all aimed at people getting more in touch with their government. And one of the culminating achievements of this progressive reform is the 17th Amendment, which called for the direct election of senators to the U.S. Senate. And up until this amendment, senators were chosen by the legislatures of each state. This, incidentally, was also something that the populist movement had proposed back in the 1890s. So you're seeing some of those elements of, you know, more people being involved with government, more government accountability, the government working for the people. Populism has this important impact on the development of the progressive movement. But progressivism, we more closely associate that with reforms aimed at the cities, whereas populist is more associated with farmers. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked again here. So along with those reforms in politics came some demand for more urban reforms. So these range from reforming the structure of city governments, increasing city services such as public transportation and lighting, improving housing conditions, and pushing for more voting rights, especially for women. When you look at the reform movements of the antebellum period, so remember back to the Second Great Awakening, you see that shift in the role that women take in leading some of those organizations and pushing for some of those reforms. We are going to see the same thing happen during the progressive era, where a lot of middle-class women are going to form organizations that try to improve the conditions of inner cities. Women defended these new activities as an extension of their traditional roles by targeting issues such as child labor, unsafe food, and poor working conditions that single women had to undertake in cities. So there is going to be women's suffrage, which is going to be a direct challenge to the power structure in voting. But some of these other progressive reforms, weren't as threatening to people, who had issues with suffrage, because they were seen as just an extension of what a woman's natural role, quote unquote, was, during this time period. So by working in things like settlement houses, which we've already talked about, a lot of middle-class women work in there to help with the social programs aimed at immigrants. Groups like the National Consumers League and the Women's Trade Union League, they push for factory reforms and better safety protection for consumers. One legislative victory was the Supreme Court case Mueller v. Oregon, in which the Supreme Court upheld a law that limited the work hours for women. And this is significant because really up until this time, the Supreme Court hadn't intervened that much in letting businesses do their own thing, and they really they didn't really support laws that maybe limited working hours. So while this does protect women from being overworked, it's important to note that the reasoning from the Supreme Court was that women were weaker and weren't able to work as long as men. So even though it's considered a legislative victory for women, the argument that upheld this lawsuit was still pretty misogynistic. So let's not forget also about the temperance movement, which is still going on. It's been going on since the Second Great Awakening, that pushed to ban drinking and the production of alcohol. This is going to continue to gain momentum over the course of the 1910s, and more states are going to enact dry laws. And in the next chapter, we're going to talk about how this culminates into the 18th Amendment at the end of World War I. So out of all the events of the progressive era, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire really puts a spotlight on the conditions that people faced working in the cities and the importance of government intervention in regulating business practices. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a garment factory in Lower Manhattan that employed young women. The factory was cramped and unsafe, and when a fire broke out, 146 women died. Investigations later showed the exit doors had been locked to keep union organizers out and to keep the girls in the factory. And the fire escapes broke when they tried to escape on those, and the elevators also didn't work. The hoses and any kind of firefighting equipment inside the building also didn't actually work. So to make matters worse, the ladders and the fire hoses from the fire department could not reach up to the 9th floor where the fire had broken out. So many of these women instead chose to jump from the building, and they died from the subsequent fall. The owners of the factory were sued, and the lawsuits resulted in them being found not guilty because technically they hadn't broken any laws. There wasn't a requirement to keep the doors unlocked. There wasn't a requirement to have safe functioning fire escapes. So think about what the solution to that is, all right? So the ensuing reforms in terms of government-mandated safety regulations is going to kind of be a turning point in American history. We've already talked about Roosevelt's foreign policy while he's president, so let's focus a little bit more on his attention to domestic issues. One of the phrases that stuck out in his speeches was the idea of a square deal between capital, labor, and the public. And when I say capital, I'm referring to business owners or industrialists. Another way to remember Roosevelt's domestic agenda is to think of the 3 C's, meaning corporations, consumers, and conservation. So we'll talk about each one of these in order. Teddy Roosevelt believed in the regulation of businesses for the purpose of protecting the American people and preventing abusive monopolies. He personally mediated a strike between the anthracite coal workers and the owners in 1902. So he's going to take a more direct role in intervening with business than any other previous American president. He also made a differentiation or a distinction between what he considered a good trust and a bad trust. The difference being, basically, if a trust had the interest of the people in mind and the people in charge acted ethically, they could be considered a good trust and would be supported by the government with some degree of regulation. However, if you were abusive and greedy and weren't really thinking about the American people, you would basically be dubbed a bad trust and you would be broken up by the government. So Teddy Roosevelt earns the nickname the Trust Buster for going after some of these larger companies like the Beef Trust in 1905, for example. In reality, Roosevelt's successor, Taft, is going to go after way more trusts than Roosevelt did while in office. But it's important to remember that Roosevelt set a lot of precedents when he was president. And one of them, he set a lot of precedents while he was president. And one of them is going to be intervening a lot more to take on corrupt business practices. So in keeping with that, the Department of Labor and Commerce was created as a government agency to oversee this new role for the president. I can't really tell if this is pro-Roosevelt or anti-Roosevelt. You have to decide. But what we do see is that he is holding in the good trust with some presidential restraint, and he's eliminating the bad trusts. Incidentally, this is also where the teddy bear comes from. Not this cartoon specifically, but there's some story where he didn't shoot a bear, and then somebody sent him a stuffed bear, and it became known as a teddy bear because his name was Teddy Roosevelt, and it's a cool story. Clearly, I remember it very, with a lot of detail. Okay, so the second C is consumers. And one of these areas of consumer protection that gains a lot of traction are medicines and food. In 1906, the author and socialist Upton Sinclair published a book called The Jungle, which was a novel that depicted the unsafe practices in the meatpacking industry. The urban legend was that Teddy Roosevelt was eating sausages while he was reading the book, but regardless of what he was eating, he urged Congress to pass legislation that regulated the production of meat. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 called for the federal inspection of meat packing facilities. The Pure Food and Drug Act was designed to prevent the mislabeling of foods and pharmaceuticals. Before this, you had a lot of medicines that claimed to do a lot of things, and there was no requirement that they told the truth. So a lot of these medicines were simply just a ton of alcohol mixed with some herbs. And the makers of these medicines would claim that it could cure everything from depression to sore knees. So it was around this time that the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, is created to bring federal oversight to these practices. The last C is conservation. The frontier was essentially closed, and so there is now an increasing call for preserving some of these public lands for future generations and not open all of it for logging or mining or industry. So conservation doesn't just mean keeping the areas untouched, although that is part of it. It also means preserving some of the resources for when America might really need it. So under Roosevelt, about 125 million acres of this land was set aside as federal reserve land. Some of this land contained coal and oil reserves that were just protected by the federal government for when they might be needed. So this is a little bit different than environmentalism, but it still is a part of that, and it leads to the creation of national parks and organizations aimed at bringing more attention to environmental causes. So environmentalism as a political issue doesn't really start to come out until the 1960s and 1970s. So at this point in American history, it's more about the preservation of land and just the enjoyment of nature. So organizations like the Audubon Society, the Boy Scouts of America, and the Sierra Club were aimed at bringing this awareness to the American people, and all three of these organizations are still around today. This is a picture of Teddy Roosevelt with John Muir, who is considered to be the father of national parks. He was the founder of the Sierra Club and advocated for the preservation of land so that future generations could enjoy being out in unspoiled nature. As you remember from the last lecture, Theodore Roosevelt became president after McKinley was assassinated. So he served 3 years of that term and then won his first election in 1904. When he was elected in 1904, he pledged that he was not going to run for president again, in part because that was kind of the tradition that George Washington had set by not serving more than 2 terms in office. So his second term is going to be a lot like the first in terms of calling for more regulation of corporations and income tax and more worker protections. There was a small panic in 1907, which many blamed on Roosevelt for his calls to rein in business practices. But the effects of the 1907 panic is that it's going to lead to monetary reforms that are going to take more shape in the 1910s, such as the creation of the Federal Reserve System. Roosevelt's successor was somebody that he basically handpicked and forced the Republicans to nominate in 1908, William Howard Taft, pictured here for some reason as a maid who is giving policies over to Roosevelt. And you can see Roosevelt, you have the big stick being carried by the valet. So Taft is going to have the distinction of being one of the only presidents to serve in all 3 branches of the federal government, first as a member of Congress, then as president, then finally as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1921. Roosevelt nominated him and said that he would carry on his policies. So you can see that Roosevelt is going to be watching Taft really closely to make sure he's doing what Roosevelt wants him to do. Let's talk quickly about the effects that Roosevelt has on the presidency. This is a comparison I think we can also make to Andrew Jackson in terms that Roosevelt really stretched the roles and the expectations of the presidency more than anybody before him. Modern presidents were now expected to take a more active role in business regulation and protecting the American people. We've also talked about how government regulation and government intervention can be considered a form of socialism, and socialism was becoming an increasingly popular idea at the time. So Roosevelt kind of represents maybe the midway point between this just like rugged individualism, that's a tradition in America, and more direct government intervention in the form of socialism. So anybody who succeeded Teddy Roosevelt would have had a tough time because Roosevelt was such a big personality. And Taft didn't really have the same political leadership style like Teddy, and he typically avoided controversy, whereas Roosevelt really enjoyed a good fight. Taft also had a tendency to really just speak his mind, which sometimes would get him in trouble. He was also not as enthusiastic about progressive reforms as Roosevelt was. Unfortunately for Taft, the Republicans are now becoming known as a party of progressive reforms, so he's going to face some challenges within his own party who think he's not being progressive enough. I want to talk briefly about dollar diplomacy and what that has to do with the overall foreign policy in this time. So at Taft's urging, businesses invested in areas of the Caribbean and Central America that were deemed a strategic concern to the United States. So American companies are helping develop the economies in Caribbean and Central American countries. These countries relied on investments from American companies, so that's a form of leverage. They could face a loss of investment if they crossed the United States. So it's basically just a softer version of Teddy Roosevelt's corollary of preventive intervention. But it's nevertheless a way to try to influence other nations by maybe withholding investment dollars. However, Taft still does use military to protect American interests, such as an intervention in Nicaragua in 1912. And Wilson is going to do that as well, as we'll see in the next chapter. As I mentioned in the previous slide, Taft actually goes after more trusts than Roosevelt, most notably the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company in 1911. As I already mentioned, there is a wing of the Republican Party at this time that is more progressive and want more reforms. And one of the things that they wanted was lower tariffs. When Taft raises tariffs with the Payne-Aldrich tariff, he causes a division within the Republican Party. Taft also fired some members of the cabinet that had been appointed by Roosevelt and were considered to be the most progressive. So this leads Teddy Roosevelt to challenge Taft for the nomination for the 1912 election for the Republican Party. Basically, he didn't feel like Taft was doing enough as president and felt like he could do a better job. So aside from this, break from tradition of serving a third term as president, that worked against Teddy. But he also didn't have enough, reformers within the Republican Party that were going to support him to get him the nomination. So once Taft wins the nomination for the Republican nomination for president, Roosevelt vows to fight on and form a rival political party to challenge Taft for his re-election. Of course, the Democrats are really excited about this because the way that our electoral college system works, Roosevelt was clearly going to split the votes between Taft, and that would lead the Democrats to maybe securing more states in the electoral college. To try to compete with Taft and Roosevelt, the Democrats agreed to put up a candidate who also had progressive ideals to take away any kind of real contrast between these presidential candidates. So the Democrats nominate Woodrow Wilson, who had been president of Princeton University and as governor of New Jersey went after some of the predatory trusts in his state. He had a record of proposing progressive legislation as governor, and so the Democrats end up picking him. Another significant fact about Wilson is that he's the first president who is going to be elected from the South since Zachary Taylor in 1848, so that's quite a long time. But remember, the Civil War and secession and everything, so it kind of makes sense. Wilson's platform for election was called The New Freedom, which was basically a series of progressive reforms aimed at addressing the issues of tariffs, trusts, and bank regulation. The Progressive Party becomes known as the Bull Moose Party, in part because Roosevelt said he felt as strong as a bull moose. And since we like to have animals associated with political parties, the name just kind of stuck. His program, called New Nationalism, was a much more progressive series of reforms than either of the two candidates. It included women's suffrage, a minimum wage, publicly supported health care, and the continued regulation of trusts and support of labor unions. As we're going to see, Roosevelt doesn't get elected, but these ideas, as you know, are still currently a part of the political discourse today as things the government could and should, be asked to do for the people. Some of these have already happened, like women's suffrage and minimum wage, but the issue over health care is still a current issue. So as predicted, the result of the 1912 election led to Woodrow Wilson winning 455 electoral votes with only 41% of the popular vote. You can see how the combined total of popular votes between Roosevelt and Taft would have been more than Wilson, but you know how the Electoral College works, hopefully. I also want to note this is the largest showing of the Socialist Party candidate in American history. Eugene Debs, who you might remember from the Pullman strike of 1894, earned almost 1 million votes, or 6% of the popular vote. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how the progressive reforms continue under President Wilson, and I'll also talk about America's role in World War I. But it's important to remember that the progressive push for reforms is now going all the way up to the national level, and the president is taking a more active role in assuming some of these progressive reforms. This is going to face some backlash in the 1920s, and you're going to see a return to many of these policies of the government not really getting involved with business. But for now, that is it. Thank you all for listening.